So what are some of the problems associated with thyroid hormones if you have too much or too little thyroid hormone? Well, one of the first things to think about is all those myriads of functions that occur with increasing thyroid hormones. A lot of those involve things like the sodium-potassium ATPase, enzymes associated with metabolism. So you can imagine if you have too much thyroid hormone around, your basic metabolic rate is high. And typically these individuals lose weight because they are hyperthyroid. The opposite is also true. If a person is hypothyroid, their basal metabolism rate is low and they oftentimes gain weight because they don't have the upregulation of all of these enzymes associated with metabolism. There are also thermoregulatory issues associated with both hyper and hypothyroidism. If a person has hyperthyroidism, their BMR is high, and therefore they're producing a lot of heat with that extra metabolism. So they are very warm and they need to dissipate that heat. The opposite is true. If you have a low BMR with hypothyroidism, oftentimes that person is cold because they aren't producing enough metabolic rate, and that is what's driving part of that process. Growth can also be affected by thyroid hormones. If you have a lack of thyroid hormone, some of your epithelial plates do not fuse well, and you can have stunted growth. You can also have stunted mental development associated with the lack of thyroid hormone. A couple of the very classic symptoms associated with thyroid hormones I'll show you next, because these are ones that show up on board exams all the time. The first is a goiter. A goiter is an abnormally large thyroid gland. So this is where the thyroid gland is in the neck. Here, though, it's hypertrophied. It's much larger than you would expect it to be. If you have a disorder in which there's high amounts of thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, that stimulates the growth of the thyroid gland. And you can see it can become very large. You can have goiters in both hyper and hypothyroidism, but it's oftentimes associated with times in which you have very high thyroid stimulating hormone. Another classic symptom that's associated with thyroid hormone abnormalities is an increase in the growth of connective tissue, especially the basal lamina. This can show up as a place where if you have hypertrophy of this basal lamina, it can cause things like your eyes to extrude out a little bit and creates things like edema. So this particular disorder will present sometimes in this way. So both a goiter and having these eye protrusions are very classic symptoms of having high thyroid hormone or being hyperthyroid.